Is the secret to world peace celibacy? Do philosophers worship clouds? Does a flea breathe through its anus? I've never read any Greek dramas, and these are surprising questions. We're reading the great books of the Western world to encounter works that we might otherwise not read. And today we're looking at the works of the clouds and Lysistrata. Now you're probably wondering, did I get anything out of reading these two Greek works? I'm not a director and I'm not a theatre student, and while I enjoyed reading them, I have no urge to take to the stage. And it was easy to start to question while I was reading them, why I was reading them. They are comic plays, they're topical, they're slapstick, almost pantomime-esque at times. It's easy to see why these works had value to the Athenians that watched them. What value do they have to me, a modern man? Just because their utility isn't clear doesn't mean that it's not important to read works like this. With any text that has survived the ages and come down to us from history, we have to assume that our difficulty with it lies within and not in the work. It's up to us to struggle to engage with this work, to pull out what's important and figure out why it is that they've survived. And it's not always the product of the classic itself that rewards us. Sometimes the reward comes in this process of interpreting, of analysing and deciphering what is unfamiliar and difficult. There must be room in our study for ideas to surprise us, to delight us, but also to offend us. It's only through engaging with difficult work that we can hope to grow. A rounded education need not include what is pertinent to us right now, but what might be important in the future, and also the context for the rest of the work that we might read while doing this. It might be the case that the importance of a work is not immediately apparent. So are philosophers up in the clouds? This first work, The Clouds, really is quite funny, and it gives us a sense of how philosophers were perceived at the time. In particular, how Socrates was perceived by his contemporaries. And we find a much more critical appraisal of Socrates than we do in his later commentators. Plato himself being no reliable witness to Socrates' actual behaviour. In this work we follow a simple story. Strepsiades is in debt because his son has gambled all the money on horses, and now he seeks to recover from this loss. Strepsiades, unable to pay his debts, turns to darker arts, to sophistry, so that he can talk his way out of them. And though at first he can't convince his son to go and learn these arts, he goes and learns them himself in an absurd house of philosophers. Chiefly, that house contains Socrates. These philosophers ask bizarre questions with no useful end, forsake the gods and worship the clouds instead. We get a sense of the opinion that philosophy was held in by the common man, and we can't really say that much has changed since. Even when we consider the philosophy practiced in Hellenistic times was much more relatable than the modern analytical philosophy. Philosophers are still held in this unenviable position. The most interesting part of the work comes after Strepsiades has been rebuffed from this school of philosophers for being literally unteachable. He then uses these same arguments that Socrates used, though he doesn't understand them, to convince his son of the same things. His son now goes to the school, and he must in turn choose between learning the right logic and the wrong logic, who are literal characters in this play. This whole section faces off philosophy and sophistry against one another. Philosophy, which would be the right logic, is ancient, old, honourable, whereas sophistry, which is the wrong logic, is tricksy and deceiving. It's proposed that sophistry is used to convince men to do ill deeds, and this is almost immediately what happens afterwards. Strepsiades manages to convince his debtors that he doesn't need to pay them for a sequence of spurious and unconvincing arguments. And those debtors, they go away not because they're convinced by the argument, but because they find it impossible to reply to him. Eventually, this wrong logic or sophistry comes back to haunt him when his son, trained in the same art, beats him after an argument, and he manages to convince his father that he was right to do so. This section raises an interesting question of ethics, which is, are there anything which is a absolute wrong or can be considered evil in all cases? The son beating the father seems almost justifiable, but it seems completely unjustifiable for the son to beat his mother. And that's exactly what Strepsiades realises, and he realises the error of his way in learning this wrong logic. The moral relativist would hold that there is no absolute moral judgment that we can make here, but that a moral judgment can only be made in reference to some standpoint, the context or the society or the historical time. That viewpoint suggests that there are no absolute wrongs, and that just doesn't sit right with me. but I don't yet have the tools and the knowledge to properly analyse that intuition. Though I think it's important for us to note what our intuitions are when we encounter these great questions. Though we must always remain open-minded. It may be that our viewpoint at this time is naive or hopelessly wrong in ways that we can't yet see. At the end of the play, Strepsiades, realising the error of his ways, decides to burn down the houses of philosophers while Socrates is still inside. And this suggests that Strepsiades isn't a particularly just or honourable man anyway. And that might give us a clue as to something deeper going on in this debate between philosophy and sophistry. Rhetoric and argument can be used to convince people to do bad things, but it might just be the case that if you can convince someone to do a bad thing, then they're just a bad person. So imagine this. Athens is at war after a failed excursion to Sicily, which has drained Athens of its military and resources. Lysistrata, one of the women of Athens, she's had enough. So she gets together the women of the city-states and she implores them to withhold from men that marital deed. They will no longer have sex with their husbands until peace is restored. The ensuing siege of the sexes results in the men finally crumbling under their desire and finally making peace amongst warring city-states. And my favourite scene of this play, the Lysistrata, is the scene outside the Acropolis. The women have seized the Acropolis and with it the funds to maintain the war. And one of the husbands approaches, begging his wife to come to him. She comes down and sees him and they decide that they will lay together. But at every juncture, the woman suddenly realises that she needs one more thing before they can begin. First she needs a pallet, but the pallet's uncomfortable, and now she needs a mattress and a cover, and it goes on, and that torture builds up in the man until he can no longer face it anymore. He will go back and implore his fellow men to make peace. Now, I'll admit that this work is entertaining, but I found it difficult to get much out of it. It's not immediately clear to me what the point of reading it was. I think the main thing to note is this relationship between men and women in Athens, and that their marriages seem to only be defined by, well, sex. And it might just be the case that this is a comic play, it's playing on a thing that we all find funny. There's something else going on here which suggests that the relationship between men and women in Athens isn't quite equal. And more importantly, the institution of marriage seems to have little to do with love and devotion, and that's on both sides. At one point, the chorus of men seem quite willing to burn down the Acropolis with their wives inside, and in turn their wives seem quite willing to enact extreme violence upon them. Many philosophers throughout the ages have urged their followers to be celibate, and when we see the sort of furious passions arise like this, we get a sense to as why that might be the case. So it turns to the question of why did we read these works? Both works are topical and they refer to people and places in Athens, and we can assume that a work like this has immense value to the historian. But to the casual reader, it also has great value. There is a universality to the human experience that transcends the ages. And I'm struck by how similar this comedy is to many of the topical news comedies that we have on television today. Comedy, even though written so long ago, can still be quite funny. There is, however, also a universality to our flaws. Media has always been used to propagandise and slander. We can only imagine a work like The Clouds did great harm to Socrates, and we understand where some of the allegations came from. And though maybe there isn't a great deal here to take away into our daily lives, the context that we begin to build is very important as we look ahead to our future works. The Republic is about governance, and we get a great sense to the governance of Athens at the time. Submitting ourselves to a reading list is an act of faith, and we have to believe that Adler gave us these works in this order for a reason. And so, even though we might not know why we're reading something, we have to trust that that understanding may become clear at some later point. Reading and studying work in unfamiliar prose and with complex names can be very difficult, and it's important that we don't allow ourselves just to skim over the text without really understanding it. And when I encounter such difficult works, I take deliberate action to ensure that I am processing them appropriately. I take time to write down what is happening, stopping every few words or lines or paragraphs, as the case may be, to write, in my own words, what I've just witnessed. And as I build up increasing familiarity with the author, the text and its structure, I might stop doing that. Sometimes I do it only for a few pages, but for more complex works, I'll have to do it all the way to the end. In general, reading with a pencil in hand is a very good idea. You can try this note-taking technique where you describe what's happening for your own assurance, but you can also note down the ideas and questions that arise in your mind. That helps keep you focused, but also gives you something to go back on. I find writing on paper rather than in the work much more useful. It's much easier to go review later. I've got no real skill or knowledge about Greek drama, and there's much I'd have to learn to really deeply analyse these works. However, by engaging with them, I still got a lot out of it. It triggered a lot of questions. I did something that I found hard, and that was useful. I encourage you to have the courage to tackle the works that you're interested in, even if you think that you don't have the necessary background. Primary texts are so rich with ideas that even if you only understand 10% of them, you'll get something important out of it. But the works that we've studied so far have been short, and the next item on our reading list is much longer. We're going to be reading Plato's Republic. And even though it's the longest work yet, it should be one of the most rewarding because it's popularly considered one of the most important texts ever written. And I look forward to sharing with you the journey of studying a work of such depth. But for now, thank you very much for listening. My name's Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice.